And so verse 13, he goes on. For I speak to you Gentiles, and as much as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh and save some of them. Again, we see Paul's heart here, his desire to see his brethren Israel saved. For if they're being cast away, Israel being cast away temporarily, is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? You know, in chapter 4, verse 17, it says, God gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did. And Paul's point here in verse 15 is the future restoration of Israel will be life from the dead for Israel. You know, in Ezekiel 37, God describes the rebirth of the nation of Israel, and he describes it as a valley of dry bones, just bleached bones in this valley that God causes miraculously to come back to life, and flesh comes back on the bones, and the bones connect to one another, and life is restored, and then God breathes on these bodies, and life is given to them. It's life from the dead. In Ezekiel 37, God says, I'm talking about Israel. This is what I'm going to do with Israel. They're the valley of dry bones, and I'm going to bring them back to life, and it's going to be life from the dead. I don't know if you know this, but Israel didn't exist as a nation for 1900 years. Israel was conquered by the Romans in 70 AD. The Jewish people were scattered throughout the world. And then after 1900 years, Israel became a nation again in 1948. And it was life from the dead. No other people group in history has lived without a homeland for 1900 years and still maintained their identity and still maintained their culture as a people and as a nation. Only Israel. If you think about your own family history, if you've been in America for 2 or 3 generations, your ancestors that came to America from another nation 2 or 3 generations ago, they probably spoke a different language, they had a different culture, they had a different diet, everything was different. And you probably have very little, if anything, left from your ancestors. You don't speak the same language, you don't share the same culture anymore, most likely, if you've been here in the United States for 2 or 3 generations. You've assimilated. That's what happens when you no longer live in your homeland. 2 or 3 generations go by and you are assimilated to that country and that culture that you're living in. But not Israel. For 1900 years, they lived without a homeland, scattered all over the world, and yet they still maintained their identity as a people. And the existence of Israel and the existence of the Jewish people is a miracle only God could achieve. Israel is life from the dead. The nation of Israel is life from the dead. It's been said that the existence of the Jewish people is proof for the existence of God. Because how else do you explain it? And Israel has been reborn as a nation. Israel will be reborn spiritually when they turn to Jesus Christ. And their acceptance of Christ will be life from the dead. Look at verse 16. For if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. Now, Paul begins to use 2 illustrations here that are probably unfamiliar to most of us, but very familiar to the first century reader. And the first analogy Paul uses is drawn from the first fruits offering that we find in Numbers chapter 15. For if the first fruit is holy, then the whole lump of dough is holy. And the first fruit that is offered represents the entire lump. So because the first fruit is holy, the entire lump was holy. And what they would do in ancient times, in ancient Israel, if you were a farmer, you would take the first fruits from your field, the first part of your harvest, and you would dedicate that to God. And it was a way of acknowledging that God had provided this for you, and that you are trusting that God will bring in the rest of the harvest for you, right? And all of it is really dedicated to Him. So the entire lump is dedicated to Him, the entire harvest. So what does the first fruit represent in Paul's analogy here? The first fruit refers to the first Jewish believers, the remnant of believers that Paul spoke of earlier in chapter 11. So the first part, meaning that small remnant of Jewish believers, is holy. It's just the first fruits. There's a greater harvest coming in, a future harvest, when all of Israel will be saved in the future.